Now, the leaders of the BRICS group of nations are arriving in Johannesburg for their 15th summit. Members, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, are home to over 40% of the world's population. China's President Xi Jinping is expected to push for the club to expand. Dozens of countries have expressed interest in joining the bloc. One leader not at the summit is Russia's President Vladimir Putin. He faces an international arrest warrant for war crimes stemming from his invasion of Ukraine. But even without Putin there, the war in Ukraine still casts a long shadow over the summit. DW's Aya Ibrahim has more on how the summit is seen from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.
People here in Ukraine will be watching the BRICS summit happening thousands of kilometers away in Johannesburg. Since the war began 18 months ago, they've been hoping to sway those countries to lean away from Russia, and even at some point towards Ukraine.
Ideally, we would want BRICS countries to start sending us weapons and to support us same way as NATO countries, democratic countries are doing. But we also understand that this is unlikely, and so the minimum plan would be to have them involved and at least do not help or support Putin. And this is why the decisions that will be made in BRICS will show if we made a good progress or not.
It is important to keep them within the agenda of resolving the conflict, because in the future they would probably gain those instruments of influence on Russia, like China.
China is the most important member of BRICS. President Xi Jinping is a very close political ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And since the Ukraine war provoked huge sanctions against Russia, it's found a welcome market for its commodities in China. Beijing has also presented a 12-point peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. Moscow welcomed the ideas contained in it, but it did not go down well here in Kyiv.
A lot of words, good words about international law, dialogue, peace, United Nations, and even about territorial integrity. But there's no mention that Russian soldiers should leave Ukraine. They do not call it a war, they call it Ukrainian crisis, which is Russian narrative, Ukrainian crisis. So they blame the West for this war.
China has its own motivation. China wants to prove its status of one of the global leaders. China is trying to prove its status of the voice of the so-called Global South.
The Global South includes the other countries in BRICS, Brazil, India, and South Africa. But China's strength may not be the only reason they've been wary of supporting Ukraine.
If you look at the top BRICS countries, you would see that in many of them we did not even have ambassadors till the recent times. And this is why it would be hard to say, oh, hi, you don't know us, but we are on the right side. Please support us and please change your way of external interactions because we are asking you so. And this is why we are trying to work intensively right now. President Zelensky is doing many active steps in involving those countries and saying you have a seat at the table.
And yet those other BRICS countries have complicated calculations of their own. India, for example, says it's neutral, yet benefits from buying cheap Russian gas thanks to Western sanctions. And although Brazil voted in the UN to condemn the war, President Lula da Silva has also accused the West of fueling the conflict by giving Ukraine weapons. South Africa has maintained warm relations with Moscow, relations that are rooted in the Soviet Union helping in the fight against apartheid. Kira Rudik says Ukraine needs to better explain itself to a whole range of countries to try to build bridges.
Countries that announcing themselves to be anti-colonial and countries that are announcing to be anti-Western, it's hard for us to work with them because they see us also as a pro-Western country. We really need to be able to show our point of view and explain how the war in Ukraine actually influences these countries in terms of the food security, in terms of the global economic security, and in terms of the building of the world security system that would not be the rule of power but the rule of law. Our way would be to explain for those African countries how their own well-being depends on the fact that Ukraine is living in peace. I had a huge meeting with leaders of African parties from different African countries. And I said, please raise a hand if you are from a country that historically had a neighbor that always wanted to destroy you. And I had a room full of hands. So the war in Ukraine is also a fight against a precedent that in 21st century one country can attack another, commit all kinds of war crimes, tortures, and then get away with that. And I do not believe there is any other country in the world that wants that.
On the global stage, BRICS countries try to present themselves as a counterbalancing option to the West, but it's not a united bloc.
Because they still do not have a strategy. It's just a forum where they discuss how they want to make this world better for themselves, for the global south, but they have huge difference in their views.
Experts here say the member states need to maintain reasonable relationships with the West. That's why they're unlikely to give Russia full support in its war on Ukraine.
They need the West also to balance the threats. In case of India, this is China. In case of African countries, this is fundamentalism, which is moving as far as Mozambique, on the border with South Africa. There is a threat of Islamic fundamentalism. BRICS will not be a bloc. This is a platform where you can discuss, where you can criticize the United States and hopefully Russia. Definitely, if they at some point declare that, oh, we are supporting Russia in this war against Ukraine, we would not like it. But they will not do that.
Discussions in Johannesburg will inevitably touch on the war that's been raging here in Ukraine. The BRICS perspective on how and why that matters to them will be worth understanding for those who want to influence the member states.
And joining me now from Johannesburg is Sanusha Naid. She's a senior research associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue and is also attending the BRICS summit. Sanusha, welcome to DW. Could you walk us through the history of the BRICS alliance, just to start with, and tell us a little bit how it's changed in recent years?
Oh, good day to you and good day to the viewers. The BRICS in itself, came together in 2009, where it was Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And one of the key things that brought them together was really the question of the global economic governance reform. At the time when they formalized in 2009, in 2010, they formed what you call the Interbank Cooperation Mechanism. And that was really around understanding how to reduce financial transaction vulnerability around capital markets, trade, the way they were basically engaged in raising equity in liquidity markets and so forth. So their core was really around these issues in terms of how do they deal, especially considering the impact of the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, which made countries vulnerable and caught in the collateral damage of the impact of that financial crisis that emerged out of the US and Europe. And this is where I think their real mainstay was around the economic financial governance reform. Over time, I think they've also started to note that there was a strategic orientation to the fact that they were trying to also recognize that their relationship to the global economy was defined by the geopolitical dimensions. The question around, are we getting enough value in terms of our voice and agency at the various institutions? How do we reform these institutions to become much more inclusive, much more fairer, much more equitable? And so you listen to the foreign ministers talk about multilateral reform. These institutions we're talking about is not just the UN Security Council, but I think also the way in which global trade rules like those in the WTO have become almost politicized.
Okay, remember, so Sanusha, if I could just interrupt you there. If I understand correctly, what's happening is it's moving from a financial to a more political vision. And I did want to ask you, what vision does the BRICS alliance have today? What is it that is uniting it right now?
I think just to basically be clear, the financial still remains fundamental to the political. So this idea that it's moving from financial to political is a bit of a broader interpretation, because what it really is that the whole financial system is politicized. And it's really now talking about that vision of the kind of reform you want, but the one that doesn't keep you in a context where the rules are underwritten in a manner that is exclusive. And of course, it creates the kind of challenges around how do you integrate around the markets, how do you integrate into value chains. And that is why South Africa has been quite critical in terms of the African Outreach Program and improving Africa's integration into the global economy. So that political is really defining by the financial issues that are underpinning the international global economy and the political economy questions of structural conditions.
And for more on this, I'm joined by DW business reporter and Asia analyst Clifford Coonan. Good to have you at the table, Clifford. We know that Western countries had been appealing to Beijing to use its influence over Moscow to bring the war in Russia to an end. In the context of China really being the key player when it comes to BRICS, what role has Beijing played to that end?
Well, I think to understand it, you really have to look at the relationship between Russia and China and just how close that is. As was mentioned a little in the report, basically China has given at least tacit backing to Russia's war in Ukraine. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that China may even have known about the war in advance, in February last year. And the peace plan that China has been promoting is very much in line with what Russia is hoping to achieve in Ukraine, and this is why Ukraine is so angry at it and why the West won't get on board with the Chinese efforts to promote peace there because of these terms. So I think China is a little bit trying to play both sides because it doesn't want to be sanctioned along with Russia if it starts supplying equipment. But at the same time, I think the general drift is certainly towards supporting Russia in Ukraine.
And just coming back to this BRICS alliance, we know that a number of countries have expressed interest in wanting to join the alliance. We know that that's going to be a big talking point. It's high up on the agenda, expansion at this summit. What would a bigger BRICS mean?
Well, I think given the basis of BRICS is it exists in opposition to something in a way. It's against Western hegemony, which isn't necessarily a great starting point. It did start life as a kind of an investment model invented by a Goldman Sachs analyst, and then it became a geopolitical reality. But they don't have a lot in common in many ways, other than the fact we have Brazil and India representing the global South, along with South Africa. Then you have Russia and China allies, then you have China and India representing economic strength. There's lots of bits and pieces, and by expanding it, I think you're going to have a lot of, these are not similar countries other than their opposition to the West. So I think that it could be quite difficult to keep everyone in line or to find agreement on a lot of things, because while they don't want to see this Western hegemony, it's hard to see what exactly they do hope to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. It's the 15th summit now, and there's very little in the way of what BRICS has actually achieved as an alliance. But I guess we can talk about this for ages, you and I, Clifford. Appreciate it, as always. Clifford Coonan, our DW business reporter, as well as our resident China analyst. Thank you.